Session 5, Pre-Independence Constitutions in Nigeria. Introduction. Having gone through the theoretical and historical background necessary for us to understand Nigeria's constitutional development, this study session will expose you to the pre-independence constitutions in Nigeria, namely Clifford, Richards, Macpherson, and Littleton constitutions. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to identify and discuss the major features, merits, and demerits of the Clifford Constitution, highlight and discuss the major features, merits, and demerits of the Richards Constitution, identify and discuss the major features, merits, and demerits of the Macpherson Constitution, and highlight and discuss the major features, merits, and demerits of the Littleton Constitution. The 1922 Clifford Constitution. Before the inauguration of the first workable constitution in 1922, Nigeria had the Order in Council of 1914 as a constitutional instrument. The instrument provided for an executive council for the entire country and a 30-member advisory, that is, deliberative council, constituted by the governor, who alone possessed the executive powers and acted on his own discretion. This constitutional instrument did not stand the test of time because Nigerians were not involved in the running of their own affairs. This led to serious agitations by the educated elite, particularly on the platform of the NCBWA, for the inclusion of Nigerians in the administration of their affairs. Indeed, the search for a workable constitution in Nigeria started in 1922, when the Clifford Constitution was enacted. Tip: in 1922, Sir Hugh Clifford became the Governor General of Nigeria, and he replaced the Order in Council of 1914 under Lord Lugard with the constitution named after him. The 1922 Constitution seemed to be a response to the 1920 NCBWA demand for elective principles in West Africa. Major features of the Clifford Constitution. The Constitution provided for the establishment of two councils, namely the Legislative Council and the Executive Council. The Legislative Council was made up of 46 members, out of which 27, being British, included the governor, were official members, while the rest 19 were designated as unofficial members, out of whom were 10 Nigerians. Of the 19 non-official members, 15 were nominated by the governor to represent various commercial and mining interests, and 4 were elected African members, including 3 Nigerians to represent Lagos as the capital and a big commercial city, and another Nigerian citizen from Calabar. This development led to the introduction of elective principle for the first time in Nigeria. However, only male adults, either British protected people or British subjects, who earned up to £100 per annum and had resided in the area for at least a year, could vote during elections. It was the first time that black Africans were not allowed to elect representatives into the Legislative Council. The council legislated only for the southern provinces, that is, the former colony and the protectorate of southern Nigeria, while the northern provinces were excluded. The governor continued to make laws for northern provinces by proclamation. The annual budget for the whole of Nigeria, including the northern protectorate, had to be passed by the Council. The Executive Council, established by Clifford Constitution, was an advisory body. It consisted of ex-officio members who were principal officials of government, nominated unofficial members, and also extraordinary members. There were no Nigerian heads of departments at the time, and so the Executive Council comprised only British officials. It was not until 1943 that African non-official members were appointed to the Council. The Council implemented all the decisions and laws of the Legislative Council. The Governor, apart from being granted powers under the Constitution to make laws for the Northern Protectorate through proclamation, was also vested with the veto and reserved powers. The Governor also had powers to nominate members of both the Legislative and Executive Councils. Furthermore, the Nigerian Council created by 1914 Order in Council was abolished. One of the reasons why powers were concentrated at the office of the Governor was mentioned by Hugh Clifford in his words. In a country such as Nigeria, which many of its areas have not yet emerged from barbarism, a strong and within limits and autocratic government is essential. See Oyediran, 2007. Merits of the 1922 Clifford Constitution. The non-elective Nigerian Council was abolished by the Constitution and replaced with the Legislative Council, which included elected members. Thus, the Clifford Constitution allowed more Nigerian representatives than there were in the Nigerian Council. It was also the first time that black Africans, in this case Nigerians, were allowed to elect representatives to the Legislative Council. The elective principle introduced by Clifford Constitution stimulated political activities, especially among the educated elites. In fact, it aided the formation of political parties in Nigeria. For example, the Nigerian National Democratic Party, NNDP, which was established by Herbert Macaulay, and the National Youth Movement, NYM, that was later succeeded by the National Council of Nigerians and Cameroons, NCNC. The 1922 Clifford Constitution also facilitated the establishment of newspapers such as the Lagos Daily News and the West African Pilot that contributed to the push for constitutional development. Above all, as the first constitution, the 1922 Clifford Constitution laid the foundation for successive constitutions in Nigeria. The merits of the 1922 Clifford Constitution. In spite of the above reforms, a significant improvement in the Nigerian Council of 1914, the 1922 Constitution still had some serious weaknesses. Not many people were given the right to vote for the 4 elected members the Constitution allowed. The income qualification of £100 per annum was too high for the majority of Nigerians, and thus they were disenfranchised. The Constitution isolated the northern Nigeria, and thus formalized a north-south dichotomy which exists till today in Nigeria. The governor was vested with too many wide-ranging powers, namely veto powers, reserved power, and the power to legislate for the northern provinces through proclamation. Nigerians were not given representation in the Executive Council. It was wholly monopolized and controlled by British officials, and so the council was not truly representative of the governed. Even the Legislative Council had a majority of white officials. Also, Majority of the members were nominated by white officials. It gave no representation to the North in the Legislative Council. The governor made laws for the North by proclamation, although they had a common annual budget. The Executive Council, which had no African representation, wielded more power by advising the governor on policies, appointments to higher positions, and on constitutional powers. The business interests of Europeans were adequately represented in the Legislative Council, whereas the North was not. The Richards Constitution of 1946. Although Sir Donald Cameron, that took over the governorship from Sir Clifford in 1931, carried out some significant political and administrative reforms. Example, the replacement of Lieutenant Governor with Chief Commissioner, introduction of separation of powers in colonial Nigeria, and substitution of provincial courts with high and magistrate courts that were under the Supreme Courts. Not much was achieved by the time he left in 1935. Prior to the end of the Second World War in 1945, serious attention was turned to constitutional reforms in Nigeria, as pressures were coming from various political associations, including the trade unions, as well as from Nigerian nationalists. Hint: two major factors appeared to have influenced constitutional development at the end of 1945 in Nigeria. These include the general strike and the attitude of the Labour Party and trade unions in Britain that called for constitutional reforms in British West African colonies. Sir Arthur Richards became the Governor-General in 1943 when he replaced Sir Bernard Bodilon, who served as Governor-General from 1935 to 1943. Although Sir Richards made proposals for a new constitution on the 12th of March 1945, it was his predecessor that prepared ground for the 1946 Richards Constitution that came into effect in 1947. In December 1944, Sir Richards dispatched his proposals to London and outlined his objects as follows. 1. To promote the unity of Nigeria. 2. To evolve the constitution to cover all parts of the country. 3. To provide adequately within that desire for the diverse elements that made up Nigeria. 4. To divide Nigeria into 3 regions, North, West, and East, and create a regional council for each, and also to create a legislative council embracing all sections of the country. And 5. To secure greater participation by Africans in the discussion of their own affairs. The major features of the 1946 Richards Constitution. Under the 1946 Constitution, there was a central legislative council for the whole of Nigeria, composed of the governor as president, 16 minority official members, out of which 13 were ex officio and 3 nominated, 28 majority unofficial members, 4 of whom were elected, 3 from Lagos and 1 from Calabar to represent business interests, and 24 nominated or indirectly elected. Out of the 24 nominated members of the Legislative Council, 9 members were nominated to represent the North, 6 to represent the West, and 5 to represent the East. 1 member for the colony of Lagos was also appointed by the governor after due consultation with the native authority of the colony, and the 3 remaining members were appointed by the governor to represent the interests or communities not otherwise adequately represented. Note: the 1946 Richards Constitution divided the country into three, and there were regional assemblies for these regions, namely Northern, Western, and Eastern Nigeria. The North had a House of Chiefs in addition. In other words, while the Western and Eastern parts of the country had a unicameral legislature, the Northern part had a bicameral legislature. Each assembly was empowered to make laws for the peace, order, and good governance of Nigeria as a whole, while the governor still retained the power to veto legislation if he considered it expedient to the interest of public order, peace, and good government. The House of Assembly in the West and the East was presided over by the Chief Commissioner, while in the North, the Chief Commissioner presided over the House of Chiefs, leaving the senior resident to head the House of Assembly. Majority of the representatives of the regional assemblies were selected from native authorities. The Northern region had 18 official members and 24 unofficial members. The Northern House of Chiefs consisted of all first-class chiefs and not less than 16 second-class chiefs selected by their order. In the Western region, there were 13 official members and 19 unofficial provincial members, and in the Eastern House of Assembly, there were 13 official members and 18 unofficial provincial members. It is important to inform you that these regional houses had no real legislative powers, as they were only established to scrutinize both the annual and supplementary estimates and the bills whose terms were applicable to the region concerned. To forge a link between the native authorities and the Central Legislative Council in Lagos, and to participate in the selection of regional representatives from their respective regions to sit in the Central Legislative Council in Lagos. In addition, they considered and advised on any matter which the government referred to them, such as any bill which might have particular reference to their regions. They were in fact only deliberative and advisory councils. More importantly, there was an executive council that had the same composition as that of the 1922 Constitution, dominated by British officials. However, 2 Nigerians, as against 1, appointed in 1943, were members of the Executive Council. Significance of the Richards Constitution. Regarding the merits of the Richards Constitution, the northern and southern parts of the country were administratively integrated for the first time since 1914 amalgamation under the Legislative Council in Lagos. It was unique because since 1916, when Lugard that amalgamated the 2 territories left, the southern and northern territories had been administered separately. Another unique aspect of the Richards Constitution was its concept of regionalism, that is, the division of the country into 2 regions, which had no precedent anywhere in West Africa, because it prepared the way for a federal constitution in the Nigerian political system. Also, for the first time in the constitutional development of Nigeria, the legislative councils, both at the central and regional levels, were dominated by unofficial majority, while the officials became the minority. Africans were allowed to secure greater representation in the Legislative Council in Lagos. Efforts were made to see that all interests and sections were adequately represented and catered for by the Constitution. The incorporation of the native authorities and the adoption of bicameral legislature in the North by the Constitution were also regarded as a new development. The Richards Constitution represented a constitutional advancement. It paved the way for further rapid constitutional developments in the country. The merits of the Richards Constitution. In spite of the above merits, many people were angry because the Constitution was promulgated with the least possible consultation with the Nigerian people. It is noteworthy that the Constitution granted the governor excessive powers to nominate members, preside over legislative and executive councils, and to override their decisions when he chose. It was also criticized on the ground that the Constitution only increased people's representation. Their participation was constitutionally limited in scope. Moreover, the constitution of the Legislative Council was not democratic, as nominees dominated the council, and it did not make an advancement in the principle of election. There were 4 elected members, 3 for Lagos and 1 for Calabar, in the Legislative Council, as it was under the 1922 Clifford Constitution, and as such, it had been argued that no progress was made towards ensuring a representative government under the Constitution. In fact, only the residents of Lagos and Calabar could vote. Therefore, majority of Nigerians were disenfranchised, as the voting right to Legislative Council was still dependent upon a given level of income. Regionalism, based largely on the ethnic composition of the country, paved way for distrust and disunity that lingered on after independence. All these made Nigerian nationalists to put pressure on the colonial government for new constitution. They sent delegation to London in 1947 to protest against the Richards Constitution before the Secretary of State for the colonies and demanded, among other things, the immediate revision of the Constitution. The Secretary of State for the colonies, however, told them to give the Constitution a trial in the first instance before talking about any revision. Macpherson Constitution. The appointment of Sir John Macpherson as the Governor of Nigeria marked the beginning of a new era of British colonial policy in Nigeria. The Richards Constitution, which was originally meant to work for 9 years, was no longer to wait for the stipulated period when Macpherson became the governor. The new Governor General, who worked to remove the charge of inadequate consultation with the public raised against the Richards Constitution, advocated fresh constitutional changes, putting into consideration the consultation with the public at 4 stages: regional, village, district, and provincial levels in his new constitutional review methods. According to him, before any change is made, it is of the uttermost importance to allow adequate time for the expression of public opinion. The draft of the Constitution followed the given stages, and finally at the General Conference held in Ibadan in January 1950, of all the 53 delegates that participated in the conference for 3 weeks, only 3 were non-Nigerians. The draft of the new constitution was approved by regional assemblies and Central Legislative Council in Lagos before its final submission to the governor. After the approval of the Secretary of State for the Colonies in London, the constitution came into effect in 1951, Main features of the Macpherson Constitution. First and foremost, the Ibadan Conference did not approve the over-centralization of power, which was the core of earlier constitutions for Nigeria. The constitution established a central legislature and a central executive for the whole country. The Central Legislative Council, renamed as the House of Representatives, consisted of a president, 6 ex-officio members, 136 representative members selected from the regions, that is, 68 from the north, 34 each from the west and the east. 6 special members appointed by the governor to represent interests not adequately represented in the House. The Central Executive, later called Council of Ministers, consisted of the governor as president, 6 ex-officio or official members, and 12 ministers, 4 from each region. They were appointed by the governor on the recommendation of regional legislature, but had no executive responsibilities. There were regional legislative and executive councils for the north. The northern and western legislative councils consisted of 2 chambers, the House of Chiefs and the House of Assembly. In the east, there was only 1 chamber, the House of Assembly. Thus, while there was a bicameral legislature in the north and the west, there was a unicameral legislature in the east. Also, the Legislative Council in Lagos was unicameral. The membership of each regional House of Assembly was made up of the following. A. The northern region had 90 elected, 4 ex officio and 10 special members. B. The western region had 80 elected, 4 ex officio and 3 special members. And C. The eastern region had 80 elected, 5 ex officio and 3 special members. The Regional Executive Council consisted of the lieutenant governors as the chairmen, 5 or not more than 5 expatriate officials not below the rank of permanent secretary, and 9 or not more than 9 Nigerians appointed from among the elected members of the Regional House of Assembly. The Regional Executive Council only gave advice on certain prescribed subjects. Examples are agriculture, education, local government, and so on. The regional legislatures would only legislate on certain prescribed subjects, such as agriculture and fisheries, education, town and country planning, native courts, direct taxation other than income tax and company tax, local government, among others. The Central Legislative Council in Lagos could legislate on all subjects and could vote on regional legislations. A Public Services Commission for the appointment, dismissal, and other disciplinary control of public officers was established for Nigeria. In the 1951 Constitution, there was the predominance of the central government over regional governments, and as such, the Constitution contained elements of a unitary constitution. But the fact that powers were divided between the center and regional government shows that the Constitution had elements of federalism. It is therefore better to refer to the 1951 Constitution as quasi-federal constitution because of these elements of unitary and federalism involved. Under the Macpherson Constitution, a system of revenue collection between the center and the regions was initiated, and this gave the latter financial autonomy to some extent. It recommended the principle of derivation needs, and national interest. In terms of policy formulation at the center and the regions, both the Council of Ministers and the regional executive councils played important role, and the doctrine of collective responsibility was put in place. There were provisions for direct and indirect elections. However, in the North, only the male taxpayers of 25 years or more voted, while in the West and in the East, both sexes voted. I should inform you at this point that general elections were held throughout Nigeria in December 1951. The houses were constituted in January 1952 in each of the regions. Merits of the Constitution. The 1951 Macpherson Constitution was very unique because its draft was discussed at all levels: village, district, provincial, and regional, and so it was more democratic than the previous ones. Nigerians fully participated as they were duly consulted in the making of the Constitution. Apart from the dominance of elected Nigerians in the Central Legislative House, it was also the first time in the political and constitutional history of the country that Nigerians constituted the majority of both the federal and regional councils. In fact, for the first time, Nigerians were appointed ministers at both the central and regional governments. Besides, councils at both levels equally became the principal instrument of policy making, thus paving the way for elected representatives of the people to rule. The Constitution granted more powers to the regional houses of assembly, which were allowed to make laws and advise on most matters concerning their people. You should also be informed that by allowing bicameral legislature in the West and the North, the Constitution promoted not only the people's participation, but also the institution of traditional rulership. A public service commission for the appointment, dismissal, and other disciplinary controls of officers was also established in Nigeria. In addition, the 1951 Macpherson Constitution reflected the increasing trend towards regionalism as the regions became political entities with both legislative and executive powers, as well as the right to share revenue with the central government rather than being administrative units. The Constitution furthered the process of federalism by dividing powers between the central and regional governments and allowing regions much autonomy. It also advanced Nigeria towards responsible self-government and spread democracy by giving Nigerians the opportunity to elect their representatives, and it also promoted the evolution of more political parties. For instance, Action Group AG and the Northern People's Congress NPC came into being under this constitution, and their effective performance. The merits of the Constitution. One of the shortcomings of the 1951 Macpherson Constitution was the concentration of too much power in the central legislature, with the decisions that emanated from the regional houses were largely subject to the approval of the Central Legislative Council, or the governor. The governor at the center also had too much power, for he could act without or against the advice of the Executive Council. Also, mass participation was hindered in the North because only male taxpayers were allowed to vote. The regional divisions worsened the problems of ethnicity and mutual distrust in Nigerian politics. No country, national political party commanded a majority in all the regions of Nigeria. Each of the three regions was controlled and run by the ethnic party of that region. The provision whereby ministers were nominated by their regional legislatures was indeed a great defect, because they tended to give their loyalty to their parties and the regions from which they came, as well as go against the principle of universal suffrage. Furthermore, since there was no nationwide party controlling a majority of the House of Representatives, the Council of Ministers would never be sure of support for its policies. The inclusion of ex-officio members in the Executive Council and the governor's reserved powers were also a defect. There was no cabinet with collective responsibility. The coalition government at the center was made up of the NCNC, the AG, and the NPC. Therefore, there was no government and no opposition. Most importantly, however, some factors eventually led to the breakdown of the Macpherson Constitution. These include the threat of northern secession by the NPC, interregional frictions, for example, the Eastern Regional Crisis of 1953 within NCNC, crisis over the 1953 motion moved by Anthony Enahoro of self-government in Nigeria by 1956. The motion asked the House to accept as a primary political objective the attainment of self-government for Nigeria in 1956, which culminated in the Kano riots in which several people died. The 1954 Littleton Constitution. The major event which led to the breakdown of the Macpherson Constitution of 1951 was the crisis over the self-government motion of 1956, which rendered the central executive, that is, the Council of Ministers, constitutionally powerless to perform its basic functions following the resignation of the AG ministers from it. This resignation resulted in conflicts between the North and the South, as well as the Kano riots of 1953. Because of the identified defects of the 1951 Constitution, the Secretary of State announced that the Constitution will be reviewed to provide for greater regional autonomy. The Littleton Constitution, which emerged from the decisions taken at the 1953 London Conference and the 1954 Lagos Constitutional Conference. At these conferences, the 1951 Macpherson Constitution was reviewed, was promulgated in October 1954. It is significant to point out that prior to these constitutional conferences, there was a meeting of northern political leaders in Kaduna where they drew up an 8-point program of action approved by the two legislative houses in the northern region. Their demands formed part of the issues that were discussed at the London and the Lagos Constitutional Conferences. The main features of the Littleton Constitution. The 1954 Constitution, which was named after the colonial secretary, Oliver Littleton, created a federal constitution. Nigeria became a federation of 4 component parts, including the 3 existing regions, North, West, and East, and the Federal Territory of Lagos, excised from the Western region. To a certain degree, complete legislative and executive powers were transferred to the regions, except for the reservation of certain exclusive items to the central authorities. The central legislature, that is the Federal House of Representatives, was enlarged, containing 184 members that were elected directly and independently of the regional legislatures, and it continued to have special members. The federal parliament comprised 92 representatives from the north, 42 each from the west and the east, 6 from the southern Cameroons, and the rest 2 from Lagos. The Constitution made provision for the continuity of the Council of Ministers, consisting of the Governor-General as the President, 3 ministers from each region, and 1 minister from the southern Cameroons, appointed by the Governor-General on the advice of each regional executive. All the members who were members of the House of Representatives were appointed by the Governor-General as suggested by the regional executives. The Constitution also provided for executive federal list, concurrent list, and residual list. The executive list specified the items on which the federal government could legislate. Examples are defense, foreign affairs, internal affairs, finance, mines and power, while the concurrent list stated the items on which both the authorities at the center and the regions could legislate. The residual list indicated areas of authorities not in the executive legislative list or the concurrent list that were within competence of the regions, for example, chieftaincy affairs. However, whenever there was a conflict of the law on any item in the concurrent list, it was provided that federal laws would prevail over regional laws. Examples: higher education, insurance, national development, etc. By implication, the regions had greater autonomy to formulate policies and execute programs, while the center focused on the matters in the executive list, including defense, banking and currency, external affairs, customs, etc. In terms of the structure of regional governments, both the western and the northern regions of Nigeria retained their bicameral legislature, the House of Chiefs and the House of Assembly, while the eastern region retained a unicameral legislature, the House of Assembly. The 1954 Littleton Constitution refrained from providing for a uniform countrywide electoral system. It left the legislatures of the regions to make electoral regulations. This led to different laws in the region. From 1955, members of the Eastern and Western Houses of Assembly were directly elected by universal suffrage, while both direct and indirect elections were used in the North. The Executive Council of each region was to be presided over by the regional governor in all its meetings, but it could be presided over by the Premier in the absence of both the governor and the deputy governor for the region, or with a special permission in writing from the governor. Lagos became a federal capital territory, forming no part of any region, with the right to elect 2 representatives to the House of Representatives. For the first time, the Constitution provided for the offices of the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker, presiding over each of the regional legislature, that is, except the Northern Region Legislature, which was presided over by the President. That is, except for the Northern Region Legislature, which was presided over by the President. The Speaker of the House of Assembly was appointed by the Governor from members or non-members of the House. Although the Constitution established a position of Premier for each of the regions, it did not provide for the position of a prime minister at the center. The leader of the political party holding a majority in the regional assembly became the premier of the region. As a result, Sir Ahmadu Bello, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, and Nnamdi Azikiwe became regional premier in the northern, western, and eastern regions respectively. There were changes of titles for public officers. For instance, the governor was to be designated Governor General and lieutenant governors as governors of regions. Other specific constitutional developments include 1. Revenue allocation focused on derivation rather than need and national interests. 2. Both the civil service and the judiciary were regionalized in conformity with the federal government structure. Provision was made for the establishment of Federal and Regional Public Service Commission, whose functions were to advise the governor on promotion, transfers, dismissals, and other disciplinary matters in the civil service. 3. A Federal Supreme Court and a High Court at the center, while regional high courts were established in the regions, including Southern Cameroons, and appeals were to be referred from the latter to the former. 4. There was also a constitutional provision for the Southern Cameroons to be separated from the Eastern region and to be granted its own House of Assembly and thereby enjoying its own autonomy. But the bill to this effect needed the assent of the Commissioner of the Trusteeship Territories. Merits of the Littleton Constitution. Nigeria became a federation consisting of the northern, western, and eastern regions and Federal Territory of Lagos. There was a clear division of powers between the regions and the center so as to prevent any conflict between the regions and the center. The Constitution made provisions for the post of permanent secretaries both at the federal and the regional levels for the first time. The number of Nigerian ministers in the government was strengthened to comply with the demand for greater regional autonomy. The Regional Executive Council in the West and the East no longer excluded ex officio members, but those of the North were retained. The judiciary, the public service, and the marketing boards were regionalized. The post of premier was created for the regions, and these premiers were Nigerians. There was provision for the Southern Cameroons to have its own House of Assembly. In addition, the Littleton Constitution improved upon the former Macpherson Constitution by making provisions for direct elections to House of Representatives. It made the beginning of direct elections to both the federal and regional legislatures. The offices of Speaker and Deputy Speaker, presiding over each of the Nigerian legislatures except the North, were created. It was a prelude to self-government for the West and the East in 1957. The Lieutenant Governor's status was raised to that of Governor, while the Governor became Governor General. This was in an attempt to maintain a federal government structure in Nigeria. The merits of the Littleton Constitution. In 1954, Littleton Constitution was regarded as a milestone in the constitutional history of Nigeria. Aripo Okoye described it as the kernel of all further constitutional changes which culminated in the establishment of the Federal Republic of Nigeria in October 1963. Notwithstanding, the Constitution still vested some autocratic powers on the Governor General and regional governors. The Council of Ministers still remained in essence a standing committee of 3 regions, as the council was still presided over by the Governor General. It failed to provide for the second chamber at the center and in the eastern region. The Constitution did not provide for the office of the Prime Minister, who should be a Nigerian at the federal level. The Governor General remained the President of the Federal Executive Council. The appointment of members of the House of Representatives were based on the three major political parties. Their appointments were party-based. This was bad because loyalty of the ministers resided in their regions, as it was under the Macpherson Constitution. The Constitution also did not institute a common electoral system for the whole country. For example, in constituting the House of Representatives, members were not elected under a uniform franchise, as adult suffrage was used in the eastern region. In the western region, the voters must have paid income tax or rates for 1 official year if he was born in the area, and for 2 official years if he was not. Only adult male taxpayers who satisfied a residency qualification of 12 months, if not locally born, were allowed to vote in the northern region. Furthermore, it failed to allay the fears of the minorities, as the regional structure favored the major ethnic groups. Thus, there was agitation for more regions. The Constitution, in addition, instituted a revenue allocation formula that emphasized on derivation instead of need and national interest. Thus, the regional structure established by the Constitution encouraged regionalism, ethnicity, and national disunity. Study session summary. In this study session, we examined the 1922 Clifford Constitution and the 1946 Sir Arthur Richards Constitution. We noted that the 1922 Constitution created the Legislative and Executive Councils to replace the Nigerian Council, which was earlier established by Lord Lugard. We also stated that it was the 1922 Constitution that brought about party politics in Nigeria through the creation of the elective principle, of which 100 was the criterion. Lastly, we focused on the 1946 Sir Arthur Richards Constitution. We stated that it was the 1946 Constitution that created regionalism in the history of Nigeria. We also noted that one of the central features of the 1946 Constitution was the unofficial majority in the Legislative Council in Lagos. We concluded our discussion on pre-independence constitutions with emphasis on the features, merits, and demerits of the 1951 Macpherson Constitution and the 1954 Littleton Constitution. End of study session 5. Thanks for listening.